If your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough.
This is the District 7 podcast for 2023-2024, presented by Podmasters. Please leave a like to support the videos on this channel. To connect with the club, look for the information in the description below. This interview is with John Morrow, DTM in Toastmasters District 84. In this conversation, we talk about his experiences in Toastmasters, mentoring, coaching, and podcasting, so really relevant to us. This is our conversation with John Morrow. I'd like to introduce my next guest is John Morrow, DTM, District 84, past podcast host, podcast chair. We're going to talk about all of these things. Good evening, John. Thank you for joining me today.
Good evening, Ray, and thank you for the honor and the pleasure and the privilege.
Hey, I'm in this because you asked me a question several months ago about possibly getting involved in podcasting, and I got fished over to help with the club that you were working with at the time. So I feel like this is a natural evolution from the discussion we had back in March of 2023, I think. I have a number of questions today. We had a pre-interview a couple of weeks ago where we had a very long conversation already, and I have a whole long list of notes that I have questions and things I want to draw about, but I have some specific areas that I feel like I want to talk to you about now, and I don't have time to go into all of it, of course, because you're a very, very busy guy with lots and lots and lots going on. But I do always start these interviews, with a question that is intended to get an interesting answer. And I always get an interesting answer every time I ask this question. John, what is the best sandwich?
Hands down, a Reuben.
That's a simple answer. Any specific Reuben, any specific place that you get that from?
The more authentic the Reuben, the better. So my definition of a Reuben is as follows. Pumpernickel rye. Obviously, corned beef or pastrami.
Ooh.
I have had a Reuben with pastrami, but corned beef, of course, is the more original meat for that. Obviously, sauerkraut, but not an overwhelming sauerkraut. A sauerkraut that has that nice sour taste, but just a slight hint of sweetness. And that would be more of a Bavarian sauerkraut. And obviously, a melted cheese on it. Most often for me, the Reubens I have a melted Swiss cheese on them. And then the prime directive, I'm a purist. I do not believe in Thousand Island dressing for a Reuben. I just think it's not appropriate. If it's a truly Jewish Reuben, it's going to have French dressing.
I could go into detail about why I enjoy that question, but the number of answers I've had to that question have given me a long list of great lunch ideas. And that, I think, is one. I could have written all of that down, but one of the podcasting things that I've just been introduced to is transcription. And if you notice the closed captioning is on, it's actually causing a transcription of this entire podcast too, which may be a tool that you use or maybe think to use in your own thing. I normally don't ask. My next question is actually a little bit unusual because I ask each one of our guests to give me a question for my next guest. And the last recording that I did, that guest asked a question that would be for you. That is really appropriate at the beginning of the question and answer setting. So I'm going to frame this one a little bit, and I'll ask you for your question later, like much later in the podcast. But this question comes from Sherry Race, who is a Toastmaster in the New Jersey area. She's very involved there, and we had an excellent conversation a couple of weeks ago. It'll be in my editing queue. This is the question she asked for you. Looking back, when you first joined Toastmasters, what were you seeking when you first joined? And the follow-up, what is your answer now?
I like that question because I do get asked that question. Usually at the end of a contest, when they do that interview, they always say, "Why did you first join Toastmasters?" And of course, why I'm a Toastmaster now is definitely different from why I was then. Back then, I thought I had it all figured out when it came to communication style. I had left the broadcast industry and I was a sales representative selling advertising specialties in advertising and marketing and public relations. But I was struggling with that and I couldn't understand why because I thought I was a good communicator. And I watched a Toastmasters meeting at a Chamber of Commerce where they did a demonstration of what a Toastmaster meeting would be like, but they did it in a mini format. It was a 30-minute gathering. And I found out that this was a recently chartered club. So what especially impressed me was how gifted these people were, and they were very new to Toastmasters. And I thought to myself, maybe Toastmasters can help me find what it is that I'm not doing right because my business involves conversations with people. Getting up in front of people, I wasn't afraid of doing, but when it came to one-on-one, I struggled. And I discovered that Toastmasters taught me first, preparation is everything. Today, Toastmasters still gives me the joy of being a communicator and gives me the joy of competing and doing so many, many other things. But the greatest gift I get from Toastmasters today is casting a vision into the lives of other people and helping them to discover their voice and be themselves. I learned a long time ago, I want people to be recognized for what's already present within them and to use that as a gift to others and then pay that forward. As they grow, they find their voice. And most of all, they discover that we never stop learning. And so I enjoy also the fellowship that I have. These people are like a family to me, a very large, extended family of people that love me and I love them. And so it is, I think, essential for my quality of life at this stage in my life. It's a part of what gives me a reason to get up every day.
I love that answer. I absolutely love that answer. I'm a project manager, a professional project manager uh, for a number of years now, and I always like to lean into the very beginning of the project, that vision statement,
Mhm.
that that the purpose statement of any project that we roll into. And I'm going to ask a little bit about that a little bit later too. Um, I have a really, really big bold note, and if this is too early to ask about from our early conversation, I wrote it down, and I don't remember a whole lot about it, but this will lead into a lot of other questions that I might have.
Yeah.
What the heck is the hesitant member's story? Do you
There,
remember that?
yeah, I remember that the hesitant member was waiting until they're ready. They were determined that they didn't want to start until they felt they were ready. And finally, one day I told a member, if you wait until you're ready, you'll never start. There's no such thing as being ready. Every day is a learning opportunity. But if you can't take a risk, then you're never going to really discover what your true potential is. You limit yourself. And I'll also say this, you can surprise yourself if you just allow yourself the opportunity to fail in the right environment. And I tell people in Toastmasters, this is the safest place in the world for you to fall flat on your face. Because when you do, these people understand how that feels because we were there once too. And we will help you up We will help you dust yourself off. We will tell you what you did well, and we will tell you what we found works for us that you struggled with, and we'll ask you to give that a try. And we'll say, come on back. There's a lot more waiting for you that's ready for you to take on. All you got to do is just step up and speak up.
I feel like I've said those well, not those words, because those words are yours, but I've said such similar words over the years. I feel like that rhymes and it just rolls off. It's a very it's an inexpensive place where you can fail, and the cost of failure is low, but the opportunity in it is high. You always learn something. You can do two things in life, which is to win. If you're really focused on winning all the time, you can win, or you can learn.
I think you can have both.
Yeah.
I also know that I think some of us don't really understand what true success is. There's a quote from D.L. Moody. A lot of people in the faith community know that D.L. Moody was a evangelist from Chicago, Illinois, and he started the Moody Bible Institute. But before D.L. Moody was the pastor of the Moody Bible Church and the president of the Moody Bible Institute and trained pastors, he was a professional in business. And he is attributed with a quote. And by the way, Robert Kiyosaki actually borrowed that quote in one of his books. And the quote simply reads, we should not fear failure nearly as much as succeeding at something that simply doesn't matter.
Yeah. I think that's great lessons that anybody can carry in as well. Mm, I feel like every member, if they can embody that, I think it will help them grow. I was thinking today while I was working on questions and thinking about our conversation, I was thinking about that moment in The Karate Kid when Mr. Miyagi is like, wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off. And the whole nature of that, sometimes the boring repetitive task leads to muscle memory that becomes really valuable later, which also leads into my Toastmasters mentoring conversational whenever I'm coaching somebody in Toastmasters. But you have an interesting history for recent Toastmasters stuff. You were Pathways Guide. You were one of the initial Pathways Guide as Pathways and Basecamp were rolling out.
Mhm.
Um, Going back to our first question, what was your story, or second question, not the sandwich question, going back to when you were initially rolled into Pathways, because you'd been in Toastmasters for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
When you were introduced to the program and learned about the program, what was the story you ended up having to build around it to encourage people to get involved with it? And how did that change? How has that changed over the last 7 years when you're talking about it?
I'm going to be quite honest with you and tell you that the feelings and the emotions that I had and the memories that I have of back then are not as vivid as the ones that I'm having now. But on the other hand, one of the things that I did enjoy in the early going was watching other individuals who were not just my peers and my mentors and my coaches, but they were people who were doing everyday life things just exactly as I was. They were in business, and communications was an essential part. And two people in particular took me under their wing to mentor me. One was actually a hospital administrator for the hospital in the city that I was working in. And he spent a tremendous amount of time working individually with people, but also as an administrator, he had to go to organizations to present his piece, encouraging benefactors. This was a private hospital. It was not a for profit hospital in the strictest sense of the word, but it needed to have people supporting it. So there were the presentations that had to be given, and the story of the hospital had to be told to people who were in a position to help provide funding or connect with organizations that wanted to fund this not for profit hospital. The other person who was a mentor to me, we first connected because our birthdays were on the same day. We were both born on June 9th, but she had a few years on me. She was a banking president of an
Mm.
institution there in the city, highly respected. And she and this other individual that mentored me, who was a hospital administrator, were as different as night and day. One was a male, one was a female. She was very Southern-esque and had a beautiful Southern accent. He was originally from the Midwest, came from Chicago, had come down to the Deep South, and had the opportunity to be involved in helping to build a great team of leadership for this hospital that was beginning to grow and thrive, but it was operating as a private hospital. And yet, both of them were the kind of people that their doors were always open. Her door was open at the bank. If I happened to be in the area working and I was making sales calls and she happened to be at the branch, I would walk in and I'd say, "Faye, got a minute to see me?" And she said, "I've always got a minute to talk to you. Come on in." And Dale Howard, who was the other one at what was at that particular time Baptist General Hospital, he always had his door open if he was in his office. But with Dale, I always had to call ahead because Dale was usually someplace talking or teaching or coaching or encouraging or seeking out donors and benefactors. But they were open hearted people and they weren't looking for any specific thing from me. They always told me, "I don't want you to look at me as someone that you want to try to emulate. I want you to listen to what I've learned and then find your own way and be true to yourself. Because if you try or pretend or act like someone you're not, people are going to see that you're disingenuous and you don't want to be bogus. You want to be authentic. And authenticity means tell your story.
Yeah.
Don't tell someone else's story. Tell your story." And that's the thing that today, even now, I still tell people when I mentor and I coach. But the difference is now the mentoring and coaching I learned in Toastmasters has grown into a personal coaching business where I'm coaching people who are not even associated with Toastmasters, who are trying to shift from what they've been doing because they feel they've hit a brick wall. I'm not a
Mhm.
psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a mental health counselor. I'm just a guy that's got a lot of treadwear. And in that treadwear, I picked up a lot of valuable lessons from people who were incredibly unselfish. And my desire is to help those people discover the best version of themselves or make the decision it's time for me to change direction. That's a
Mhm.
shift, but that requires that they get the right kind of mindset, which brings me to the other two things that I talk to people often about, and that is Dr. Dweck, who wrote the book about mindset, talks about the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. I have a fixed mindset, but the fixed mindset has to do purely with my core values. Those are not subject to change because they are the framework of who I am as a human being.
Mhm.
But a growth mindset, that doesn't stop because the letter L in my power word resolve stands for lifelong learning. And only a person with a growth mindset will love every single day for the opportunity to learn. And I always learn. I'm learning every day. I keep learning. I believe in learning, and I think learning gives vitality and keeps you alive longer and keeps you healthy longer.
I think the curiosity that comes along with learning also helps you be interested in in running in and learning new things.
Mm,
That something that I've been working on myself is is leaning into my curiosity in a healthy way,
Mhm.
which I find really valuable. And it gives me so much energy as long as I don't run into somebody that goes, "Why are you asking that question?" Whereas the better answer is always, "That's an interesting question. I might word it this way, though." And it gives you enlightenment. That's where the mentoring and the coaching comes in, is being able to identify the barriers in the curiosity rather than um, present them as why you shouldn't go ahead.
Right.
That's I know we talked a lot about mentoring and coaching in our pre-interview, and I have a few things about resolve and best practices, which I was going to come to a little bit later, speaking about your podcast and some of the technical things and background that goes into that podcast. But just before we leave the Toastmasters paths and pathways all behind, what's the if you were to pick a project that you've seen done the most interesting or that you've done yourself that has helped you in the current program that's helped you leaning into it from whichever path you've completed. Was it a podcasting project, or was it a leadership style project, or leaning into whatever story it was from you?
A lot of things have grown out of, as I've been working through paths, the high performance leadership, which is where you don't necessarily have to do something within a club setting. You can go and do something that is outside a club setting, but you can bring not just people in a particular area of specialty to come along as part of your advisory committee, but there are Toastmasters there to remind you too as you communicate the message. You want to create an enthusiasm and a support group there to do it. In 2023, actually, I'm going to adjust that. In 2022, in November of 2022, at a challenge from a Toastmaster who at that particular time was providing coaching to me on how to begin to start my business. If to explain, I had retired. I was no longer doing the 9 to 5 thing, but I wasn't content with just sitting still and doing nothing. Additionally, because I had lost my wife
Mm,
to a premature death in 2019, I found myself needing to get back into doing something useful. I wasn't one of those that wanted to simply curl up into a fetal position and wait to die. I'm still here. And I benefited so much, not just from what my wife did to transform my life, but everything that she allowed me to participate in. And most importantly, all those years in Toastmasters, even though she never was a Toastmaster, she was my number one fan. And when we had contests and conferences, she was always right there on my arm with me. She
mm,
was my number one supporter. And now my coach was seeing in me that I had this desire to be useful, but I hadn't been able to put my finger on it. He says, I think before you do anything, you need to tell your story. I said, well, what are you recommending? And he says, well, you've told me that you dream of writing a book. So I'm going to put you on the spot and I'm going to challenge you to write the book. And he said, I'm also going to challenge you to pick yourself a advisory committee, and I'll be on that committee with you because I'm your coach. I want you to pick 2 or 3 other people who have had experience with writing and have a book published or publishing a book. And I want you to get busy writing your book, and I'm going to put you on a schedule. I said, oh, okay. And so I began in November of 2022 on a chapter by chapter basis. And the challenge was every week, bring a chapter. And I would bring that chapter. And then when we would have the advisory committees once a month, I would share the progress. I would get feedback, editing ideas, content ideas. and I was given tips. And every tip that was given to me was take this message, streamline it to things that you personally had an experience with, and use that to motivate people to realize that just as you were able to do that through finding this particular approach to having and building a successful life, you can do the same thing for yourself as well, for others. And in 2023, in October, the book was published and launched on Amazon. And it was the first book I had ever written. And it is not a particularly long book. It's just 112 pages long in a paperback, and it's also available in ebook form. But it is my message. But what it became, I didn't dream it would look like this. I had no clue. I was just writing down, like journaling based upon a power word. But that framework helped me to build a book with a core message, but it also then brought in things into my life that I could put into the book that helped people to begin to realize this was more than just a word. This was a set of operating principles that I could use. That's an example of how a high performance leadership program has helped me mightily. Another high performance leadership program that I worked on was that I would challenge myself to start my own business, and that business would be incorporated, and it would have a fundamental, specific mission, vision, and purpose. And so during the course of 2023, I worked on building that business so that in conjunction with the launch of the book, I incorporated as an LLC. And that's where the term I never noticed LLC came from, because the I never noticed is another message that I teach people in my coaching.
Yeah. Well, I in my research looking into, because I know you hosted a podcast before you were the podcast chair for District 84.
Mhm.
You had your I never noticed podcast, and the whole concept and message behind it. And I need to listen to it some more to get into it. But I never noticed and resolve and living in the now as some common themes that you've got now. What was your first podcast? Now I know a little bit about the story about it, but not a huge amount of the story about it. Tell anybody who's listening here, what was your inspiration for starting your first podcast?
My mother, and it was her affliction with Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And it grew out of an experience that took place back in 2011 after my father died. My father died in June of 2010. Dad was retired. Mom had just retired, but she retired late. She was 77 when she retired as a registered nurse. She really didn't want to retire, but she had something going on that was beginning to hamper her ability to be an effective nurse and also an effective teacher, because she taught certified nursing assistants as well. My life was in Florida. My sister and her husband's life was in Western Illinois, outside of St. Louis, just across the Mississippi River. Mom and Dad were there in Southeast Tennessee in my birthplace, Chattanooga, Tennessee. They were retired and living together. We'd had some vacations together, but I was off doing my own thing. My sister and her husband were doing their own thing, and we'd get together from time to time. And I noticed things about Mother, but I thought more of them as being that she was obsessive compulsive. And what I discovered was after Dad died and Mother had to begin this coping process of living by herself in this big, fully paid for house, with Dad having done a wonderful job of leaving her a great, stable financial situation so that she wouldn't have to worry about paying for her bills or losing her home or anything like that. One day we started getting phone calls from friends who said mom's doing some things that are just extraordinarily scary and have to do with their money. And so we paid her a visit unexpected, and the greeting that we got from her when we showed up unexpectedly told us something isn't right in Dodge. What we learned was that dad saw but wasn't able to share with us that her whole family was afflicted with Alzheimer's. It was a genetic propensity.
Mm.
Dad never lost his mind. He was brilliant. He died from complications from surgery, and that was the only reason why he was lost to us, was that something went wrong in the recovery process and he was lost. But he was a brilliant man. And mother was brilliant too, but she was a very independent thinking woman. And when Alzheimer's began to change her, first it was short term memory, which we thought, when she repeated things, was simply her obsessive compulsive nature, or so we thought. But then when people started calling her, soliciting money from her, and she started giving money away because she was convinced that this was something that would increase and give her more and help her pass on more to her family, and she couldn't make intelligent decisions and she was being preyed upon and we had to intervene, we were greeted not with someone who said, "Thank you for coming to my rescue." We were greeted with someone who told us in no uncertain circumstances, "It's my money. I'll spend it any way I want to." And my sister and I were flummoxed. And then we looked at each other and said, "How come we didn't notice this? The signs were there." Well, you see, that's the
Mm.
problem. The signs are
Yeah.
there, but we don't notice because we're too busy doing our own thing.
We
That's where I
never
never
noticed.
noticed. So my first podcast that I did with the help of my friend who was uh, a fellow Toastmaster was just as raw and crude as it could be. A laptop, a microphone, and that was it with Audacity. And then
Hmm.
I put it on the SoundCloud.
SoundCloud.
I put it on SoundCloud. And it was about Alzheimer's. It was about understanding the clues of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. I talked about not noticing these things and that we need to be more fully connected and aware of it. I became an advocate for caregivers. I told them, I said, caregivers take it brutally. They're treated terribly. I've got a friend who's right now got a mother going through a very, very rough dementia stage who lives over in Palm Bay, Florida on the Atlantic side of the state. She is her mother's full-time caregiver. She doesn't have anybody else that can come in there and cover for her. And there are days when she's just one hot mess because her
Hmm.
mother is so hard to deal with. And so I became an advocate first with the I Never Noticed message on helping people understand Alzheimer's and dementia, and also spending more time living in the now and beginning to realize that we're fearfully and wonderfully made and we miss things all the time, but our mind doesn't miss anything. Everything gets recorded there. It's just that sometimes you need to slow down and take a closer look. So that's where it began. And I did those podcasts and built on those and had someone with me who would partner with me to make sure that we were touching on good points. And we even interviewed some interesting people. And then my wife died and it all
Mm.
stopped.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Wow. So that's an interesting kickoff point for your podcast. I love the message, the base message of it, of just it's okay not to notice things, and then when you recognize that you didn't notice them, to highlight them and tell those stories. I'm very involved with the multiple sclerosis community, and I've been telling stories around that as well, and especially newly diagnosed people who have a distorted imagination of what it could be like, at least at first, and the rhythm of it. So getting that kind of storytelling about all like Alzheimer's, it would be an incredibly powerful forum to be able to share those kind of stories. Now, you came back to podcasting later. So you were podcast chair for District 84 in 2021. How did that happen?
Well, I've always been a big fan of podcasting and some projects that I did. And one of the Toastmasters projects in the electives, as you know, I think it's in level
Mhm.
3, is create a podcast,
Level 4.
level 4. And so I taught a workshop on how you can start a podcast. Podcasts are easy to do in terms of tools. Now, of course, if you want that podcast to have more bells and whistles and you want it to have good video because you want to utilize the opportunity for it to not just be an audio podcast, but have the video component and have graphics, and you want to have good editing skills. You want to be able to incorporate music into it that you can use for breaks, and you want to get it to a place where it's on a platform that it's getting traction on many sites, which can, over time, as you gain listeners, you're rewarded with a monetization process beginning. I was telling people that doing a podcast doesn't have to be all of that. You can start with something as simple as a laptop, a microphone, and a recording software,
Of course,
and you
yeah.
can produce a podcast. And there are platforms that'll let you put that podcast up there for free.
Yeah. Well,
And that
I,
was what
I was Yeah. I was going
yeah.
to say like this podcast is hosted on the District 7 Toastmasters YouTube channel. And of
Mhm.
course, because it's a Toastmasters podcast, it's not monetized and is never going to be monetized.
It's a not for
But
organization.
it's a not-for-profit organization. Our entire purpose, our entire goal is to basically draw all of the information out of you and everybody else that we get a chance to interview to help improve and grow their experience within Toastmasters and maybe using this medium as well. How many episodes did you end up producing as the podcast chair that year that you were doing it?
The That year we went from the previous year doing 6 episodes to the following year doing 36 episodes.
Oh wow. So you just off and running and then went with it. And I guess of course because 21, 22, everything is going to be very virtual and very Zoom, you have that kind of availability of technology to incorporate as well.
I had a
How-
team too because I was able to find two ladies to join me and become a part so that we became really a threesome. I was still podcast chair, but these two women were both brilliant in their own ways and enjoyed podcasting. One had her own streaming podcast that she streams virtually on YouTube. And I invited her to join us. So we put our heads together, and we weren't just recording podcasts for the sake of recording them. We actually had specific goals that we wanted to accomplish, either each of us individually interviewing someone or talking about a specific subject, or the three of us would come together. For example, we did a 7-part series on moments of truth.
oh wow.
In moments of truth, what we talked about were what we referred to as club best practices for the best possible success for your club, regardless of whatever particular state it's in. And it was to let people know that moments of truth is not just too many moments of truth that I've seen in club settings are just utterly incredibly boring. It's somebody
Mm.
standing up there reading a script and you're filling out a form and you're having some discussion about club practices and what you're doing. And there are 36 total things that are involved that work. It just depends upon the particular club and its setup. And you also have to remember, too, that because of COVID and us being for a period of time, they're really kind of trapped in a Zoom based environment. Our podcast almost always talked about how do you make best practices work in a Zoom based environment when you're not enjoying the opportunity to be together physically. So the best practices process required conversation. It required devil's advocacy, if you want to put it that way. Hey, what about a situation like this? How would you handle it? There is no right answer, but we learned through the Moments of Truth section that we did that every club needs to take its temperature as to its personality, its climate, its demographics,
Hmm.
its total makeup of the club, and then what you want to do using best practices through moments of truth as a framework. Develop a system where you can make sure that people are engaged, they're accomplishing goals, and they're getting celebrated for doing so. And at the
Mm.
same time, you're creating novel opportunities to do things that are completely unconventional.
I
I'll t-
think I I think I need to track down that entire series that you did with your co-hosts on Moments of Truth, because I'm talking to my club about doing a Moments of Truth, incorporating a Moments of Truth into our regular in-person club meeting again. And it's been a while since I've actually been through one. So I think a podcast like that would be interesting for me to lean into. And what I can do for this podcast is I can actually track down, if you can give me the link to that playlist, if that is a playlist, if it's still available, I could even link it in the description of this video when it goes up, because I feel like that's an important resource that everybody should, that is a resource that I think a lot of people could lean into, to tell that story for it. How, so, question about the scheduling, because we talked a lot, a bit in our pre-interview about some of the technical stuff in the background for how it was producing. How did you pick and choose and work with your support staff to identify where their strengths would help improve things?
brainstorming. We were,
Brainstorming.
yeah, we brainstormed. We got together on Zoom one evening and we started talking about ideas. And I said, we need to make sure that not only we have ideas which we can coalesce together as a threesome, but I also wanted to make it clear to Leslie and to DJ, who were my partners, that they also had things they wanted to do. They were uniquely equipped and skilled to do. They each had their own special personality types and dynamics, and each of us had different strengths. So this wasn't all the time about focusing down on one thing. It was about a marriage of ideas, and interspersed within that marriage of ideas were specific Toastmaster based things that the three of us could talk about periodically. So the episodes ran like there might be an episode where DJ did a two-part episode where she interviewed people about a specific subject. There would be like a two or three-part series where Leslie would do interviews of an entirely different nature. Leslie was especially good with how to put together a conference and what are the steps involved in conferencing. Plus, she worked for Walt Disney Corporation and
Hmm.
she was involved in the Imagineering process. And so Leslie had these bright, brilliant ideas about creative thinking and staging and casting and production and stage time and all the things that apply, because you have to remember Walt Disney isn't just a theme park organization, they are an entertainment monolith. And
Yeah.
of course, because we're in Central Florida, and as we affectionately say, the mouse is a 35-minute drive from my house. The mouse sort of dominates the scene here, and Leslie's a part of a huge infrastructure that is Disney. And
Yeah.
Disney in of itself a freestanding entity. So
I don't think
all
you
of
could talk to anybody in the world, and Disney would be, Disney would feature very prominently in, well, at least childhood memories of my generation and
mine
maybe
too.
yours too.
Mine too.
Um, but yeah, and speaking of which, Steamboat Willie just came off of copyright protection, so I'm
Yes.
interested in seeing that too.
But the entire thing about it was when we would brainstorm, we would write down a list of potential ideas. We would put beside them any people that would be a part of the guest list, or we would share ideas of someone that we might be able to have, or more than one person to join and have a discussion forum. And interspersed, we would do these triple headers, as we call them, or these triple threats, not triple header, but triple threat, where the three of us would come together and we'd target a specific message that was very core based on Toastmasters. But because Leslie was uniquely gifted in her particular skills in Toastmasters, and DJ truly was gifted in hers, and then I had my own niche, we never had a recording where we didn't have the opportunity to create a variety of opportunities with the mindset of opening up people's thinking instead of trapping ourselves into a mold or into a corner or putting ourselves in a box. Because the thing that Toastmasters need to realize, and this is why Pathways is I'm so fanatical about it. Too many people think Pathways is purely just what you do at Toastmasters. No,
No.
no. Everything that I do out there in my line of business and the work that I do and the opportunities that I get to speak to people as a professional speaker, as a as a pro bono speaker, as a podcaster, as a facilitator, as a person conducting enrichment sessions, doing webinars and workshops, and of course, working on building now some YouTube sessions and doing stuff for my business where I'm out there producing. I'm now writing a blog. All of
Mhm.
this is built around the idea that this has a Toastmasters connection to it, in that if I have Toastmasters holding me accountable and they're following my progress, there are projects throughout the entire Pathways Learning Management System that tie directly to these projects. And the only thing I need to do is to be sure that clearly the work was done, that a Toastmaster saw and heard the work being done, and the Toastmaster could write the evaluation letting me know how well I did that, and I could get the credit for doing it. And I'm trying to get people to think outside the structure of just a club. Toastmasters is for life.
I have ADHD and I always have mental images, dyslexia and ADHD. So there's always pictures in my head as I hear people talking. And you know what came back into my mind is that Karate Kid, wax on, wax
Right.
off. Every single project has a muscle that you flex and a
Mm-hmm.
skill that you build. It gets a little bit bigger and then a little bit smaller and then a little bit bigger again. And it's just a constant growth and an evolution every
And you
single piece.
surprise yourself.
Oh, yeah,
You
always.
surprise yourself. And that's when it really gets fun because and I was asked the other day, I'm not currently tied up in a position where I'm barred from competing in club contests. And I was in the area contest. And when they were interviewing me and all of the contestants after the contest was over with, before they announced the winners, I had filled out that biographical profile sheet that you can get online from Toastmasters. And they asked me what my favorite quote was. And the first question that the contest master said was, "Has that always been your favorite quote?" And I said, "No, my quotes keep changing because as I'm changing, quotes come into my life that are much more applicable to where I am at this stage in my life." And my current favorite quote, and I don't have the name of the author, but it's a woman, and it's not new. It's been around for a long time, but she said, "If your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough."
That is, I'm going to write that right down. Actually, no, I'm not going to write that down because we're talking right now, but I have the transcript. I'm going to look at that at the end and I'm going to come back to it because I have an Apple Note that has a list of quotes that I come back to. And I actually, in my email, I have a PS behind my signature that says quote of the day, because what I do is I come back to my list and there's so many quotes that are relevant to me and have been relevant to me depending on what I'm emailing about. But the very top of it is actually a Seneca quote. It is, we suffer more in imagination than we do in
Wait
reality.
till we ever. And Seneca was brilliant as, people say stoicism is a negative mindset. No, it's not.
No.
Stoicism can bring the greatest amount of peace and reassurance because all things happen for a reason. And when you can learn to look at it and say, okay, when you run into a wall, find a new way either through it, over it, under it, or around it. But
Yes.
don't stop just because you ran into a wall.
And then the second quote on my list that I'm looking at ties exactly to what you just said. There is never any need to get worked up about things you can't control.
Right.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius. Anyways, that's, I don't want to go into
I have that book
a
too.
quote. I don't want to go into a quote off because, we could go on for another hour over this. But we're reaching towards the end of the conversation of the things that I wanted to talk about for this session. I feel like we could talk about a whole bunch more things. I know you have a book that's relaunched with Resolve. I know you've relaunched your podcast now.
Yes. It's on Spotify.
It's on Spotify.
It's
What's it
audio.
called?
It's called I Never Noticed 2.0.
Oh,
So I
wow.
kept the I Never Noticed name and I just added 2.0 because when I launched it in October of 2022 in conjunction with launching my book, I wanted it to be still I Never Noticed. I Never Noticed is my brand. I incorporated that brand. I will never stop using that because I Never Noticed gets attention and people ask me questions and that opens doors for conversations. The difference is it has, because of my wife's death, the door has opened for me to even more affect the lives of people through the framework for personal and professional best practices in daily living by using Resolve. But flowing through the bloodstream of the Resolve mindset is the reminder that we need to allow ourselves the opportunity to see more, hear more, feel more, smell more, and taste more of what's right there in front of us that we all too often miss because we put a device in front of our face or we have our mind on something that has nothing to do with what we're doing right now and we lose valuable opportunities to experience today. And living in the now is more than just a phrase. It actually works. And yet you can still plan and dream. But you remember those are abstracts.
Hmm.
The thing that is happening right now that you can do anything about is what we're doing right now.
Yeah. There's a line from a book that slapped me across the face when I read it when I was in my 20s. Um, and it was a line from a character in a book by Dan Millman when the lead character of the book is told to go sit on a car for a day and then watch what's happening. And the guy gets off of the car at the end of the day and says, nothing happened. But the line that sticks with me is when you take the moment back and then you watch everything that happened while nothing was happening. And the line was, there is never nothing going on.
That's right.
Never nothing going
No,
on.
there's never nothing going on.
There's somebody dropping somebody off in the roundabout just outside where I'm at. If I look out the window, there's a person up in the
I,
kitchen and across the
I
way.
have I have four cats. They don't they don't generally come in here while I'm on my computer doing recordings. I don't know what it is about that. If I'm sitting here keyboarding and working case files and correspondence, I have one that likes to walk across my keyboard and do typographical errors for me. On the other hand, there's a tomcat right over here to my right who has a space that he likes to sleep at. And through my entire recording process, he sleeps in that spot. Proximity. But if I turn and look, there he is. And if nothing else, the stomach is rising and dropping, rising and dropping. And he's in complete peace. Oh, to be able to sleep any place I want to and not be the least bit worried about what's going to happen.
It's like the line we used to say as teenagers after a party, sleep where you fell. Some of those parties. Okay, so we're just wrapping things up here now. And uh, at least for this conversation, I feel like we could have more conversations if you're open to them at some point as well. But the way I like to finish these podcasts off is the first thing is I'd like you to tell me what is it that you're pitching. What is your pitch right now? Is it your book? Is it your podcast? Where can we find John Morrow when we finish watching this recording now?
I will first pitch the fact that I have a website, inevernoticed.com. And at inevernoticed.com, and I'm fortunate to have a marketing specialist who also handles my website for me. That's where you can get a general overview of me. My book, Resolve, which I do have through Amazon in both paperback and in ebook form. And I'm working right now, as a matter of fact, and recording what will eventually be the audio version of the same book. But that book is with Amazon, and the tagline in that book is important. Resolve is the power word, but the tagline is your blueprint for intentional success. And then, of course, coaching, mentoring. But one of the things that I tell people is, unlike a lot of people that you see on social media professional sites, I'll use LinkedIn because I do engage LinkedIn among other social media sites. I'm a little bit different. I'm a nonconformist. I push back against anything that says I should be predictable. I am very unpredictable. I'm not conventional at all. And the first thing people will find out that surprises them is that if you talk to me about possibly hiring me as a personal coach, I will tell you we're not at the hiring stage. We need to have a powerful conversation with each other. No time limit. We will talk as long as we have to so that I can learn as much about you as I can, where you are, where you want to go, and if I can help you do that. And if I can help you do that, then we can talk about hiring me.
Nice. That is a great answer to that question. I yeah. I absolutely agree. So many coaches are like, "Yeah, I can help you. I can help you. I can help you." And then yeah, leading into it. The final thing I'm going to ask before we complete the interview, before I complete the interview off, is I ask my guests to ask a question, staring right into the camera, to my next guest. I don't know who this next, well, actually, I do know who this next guest is. I said the same thing to Sherry. But all I'm going to tell you is this person is a Toastmaster and they have Toastmasters involved with them. What is a question you could ask them that might elicit an interesting answer from them that you might be interested in hearing?
I told you I'm unconventional. Because of your experience, what's the best medication for the failure that hurts you the most?
I think that is going to be a really, really good question for our next guest. And with that, I want to thank you, John, for being my next guest on the District 7 podcast in Washington and Oregon State. And what a great conversation. Thank you for being my guest.
It's been my honor.
That was episode 11 of the Toastmasters District 7 podcast. My name is Ray Miller. Thank you for watching the video to the end. I want to thank John Morrow for being my guest and for our great conversation. We talked about club leadership, we talked about podcasting, and many more areas John is involved with in Toastmasters International. The District 7 podcast is presented by Podmasters Toastmasters. The contact information is just below me and also in the video description. We have a few more episodes to release before my run as the District 7 podcast chair comes to an end. And I'm going to move on to the next edit right now. I'll see you again in a couple of weeks.